My name is Marion Blake. I'm 67 years old, and for nearly 4 decades, I was the quiet strength behind Silverleaf Vineyards in Sonoma, California. My husband Henry and I built it from scratch. Rows of vines stretching along the hillside, the wooden tasting room we painted ourselves, the small farmhouse that smelled like fresh baked bread and crushed grapes. It wasn't just land. It was home. It was legacy. 2 weeks after Henry's funeral, while the house still smelled faintly of the lilies from his service, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee when I noticed 2 envelopes on the counter. One was from our family lawyer, Mr. Alton. The other, thicker, colder, was from my son, Oliver. I opened Oliver's first. Inside was a letter printed on his New York firm's letterhead. Silverleaf Holdings Transition Plan. Transition plan? My stomach turned. I read further. Talk of asset optimization, streamlined ownership, retirement options, and below that, a form requesting my signature to transfer the vineyard's ownership to Oliver and my daughter Clarissa. Clarissa had always been more like Henry. Gentle, thoughtful, but she'd changed. I saw it in her eyes during the funeral, more focused on catering orders than on her father's memory. I set the letter down and opened Mr. Alton's envelope next. It was a formal request to meet regarding updates to Henry Blake's estate. The timing wasn't a coincidence. That afternoon, Clarissa arrived wearing heels that didn't belong in a vineyard and carrying her tablet like it was an extension of her hand. Oliver followed, his suit jacket draped casually over his shoulder. They sat at my kitchen table, our kitchen table, and spoke in calm, professional tones about inevitabilities. Oliver called it modernizing the brand. Clarissa used the word downsizing. And then came the phrase that made my chest ache. Mom, it's time for you to start thinking about retirement. Retirement? From my own home? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply folded my hands on the table and asked one question. Did your father sign off on this? Oliver hesitated. Clarissa glanced down. And in that silence, I knew. They had a plan. One that didn't include me. One that saw me not as their mother, not as the woman who pruned vines in the rain and crushed grapes until her hands ached, but as an obstacle. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. That evening, after Oliver and Clarissa left my kitchen, their folder still sitting on the table like some kind of corporate ultimatum, I sat in Henry's old armchair by the fireplace. My fingers traced the faded stitching on the armrest, and I felt the familiar ache in my knuckles, not just from arthritis, but from something deeper. Anger. Not the hot, wild kind, the slow, steady kind, the kind that doesn't make you shout, but makes you stand your ground. I replayed their words in my head. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Mom." Clarissa had said it like she was offering a kindness, but it wasn't kindness. It was an eviction masked as concern. And that signature, Henry's signature, I'd spent 40 years watching him sign every check, every delivery slip, every anniversary card. By the end, when the cancer had spread to his bones, he could barely hold a spoon. There was no way he signed those papers with such a steady hand. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with a pen and pad, jotting down names, dates, the lot numbers of every parcel of land attached to Silverleaf Vineyards. My mind kept circling back to something most people had long forgotten: the 40 acres Henry and I purchased before our wedding. It wasn't part of Silverleaf's main holding. It sat just adjacent to the vineyard, bordering the creek. Purchased in my maiden name, Marion Burke, before I ever became Marion Blake. It was Henry's idea back then. Always keep something separate, he'd said, for the just-in-case moments life throws at you. I never needed it before now. But standing between me and my children's betrayal, those 40 acres suddenly meant everything. Because what Oliver and Clarissa didn't realize was that the vineyard's irrigation system depended on water rights tied directly to that parcel. Without it, Silverleaf would dry up within weeks. No developer would touch land without guaranteed water access. By dawn, I was in the attic, pulling down the old lockbox Henry had stored under a pile of quilting supplies. Inside was the original deed. My name, clear as day, my signature, Henry's signature as witness, and, most importantly, the water rights certificate attached. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the rising sun casting soft light through the old dormer window. I felt no satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet steadiness. I had something they hadn't accounted for. By mid-morning, I was at Mr. Alton's office. He raised his brows as I laid the deed in front of him. He said, "Marion, you've been holding on to aces," he said quietly, studying the document. "With this, you control everything." I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I glanced out the window, watching a pair of teenagers skateboarding down Main Street. Life kept moving, no matter how much yours felt like it had stopped. Mr. Alton looked back up at me. "Do you want to contest the will now, or do you want to handle this quietly?" Quietly. Always quietly, but firm. I want them to understand they don't own me or this land. That afternoon, Oliver called. I let it go to voicemail. Then Clarissa texted, "Mom, please pick up. We need to talk." They could wait. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one waiting on them. That evening, I walked the vineyard rows alone, my boots crunching over dry soil, the air still cool with early spring. At the edge of the property, I stood by the creek that bordered my 40 acres. The water shimmered under the fading light, constant and steady, just like I intended to be. They thought they could move me like a piece on a chessboard, but they forgot who planted the board in the first place. By the next morning, I wasn't just prepared emotionally, I had a plan. I knew Oliver and Clarissa would come early, eager to wrap things up. Sure enough, at 9:15 a.m., I heard their car crunch up the driveway. Clarissa stepped out first, high heels on the gravel like she was heading into a boardroom rather than her mother's front porch. I let them in, quiet as a shadow. There were no raised voices, no accusations. Instead, I stood by the kitchen counter as Oliver smoothed out his suit and said in that clipped tone, "Mom, we've made arrangements for you to tour Pine Ridge today. We'll drive you down. It's a beautiful place." I only nodded, sliding my arms into the sweater I had laid across the back of the chair. My purse sat beside me, heavier than they knew. Inside wasn't just my medication. It held the deed to the 40 acres. And my passport, my birth certificate, my quiet weapons. They didn't ask why I wasn't resisting. That was their mistake. We drove in silence. Clarissa's nails tapped against her phone screen, Oliver humming to some corporate podcast on the radio. My eyes stayed on the window, tracing the orchards as we passed. The orchards they believed they already owned. But halfway down County Road 17, Oliver slowed, signaling off toward a narrow dirt path I hadn't walked in years. My stomach tightened. I already knew what was coming. When he pulled onto the shoulder and put the car in park, I said nothing. "This is where you get off, Mom," he said smoothly, not even glancing over. Clarissa's lips parted slightly as if she might protest, but then she didn't. She just looked out the window. Oliver reached across me, opened my door like it was any other stoplight. "You've got your things. The house and Vineyard are ours now. There's a bus station not far. Someone will help you." For a moment, I simply sat there. Then, with slow deliberation, I reached for my satchel, swung it onto my shoulder, and stepped out. My flats crunched on the gravel, dust rising around my ankles. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. I simply closed it gently behind me, hearing it latch with finality. The car pulled away, its wheels spinning loose pebbles into the air. I didn't wave. I just stood until their taillights disappeared around the bend. It wasn't fear I felt. It wasn't even heartbreak. It was power. Quiet, settled power. Because in that satchel was everything Oliver and Clarissa had forgotten about. The deed, the paperwork, proof that I wasn't some frail woman to be shuffled into silence. I turned then, walking, not toward the gas station Oliver mentioned, but toward Hazelbrook town proper. It took over 2 hours. My shoes weren't made for long walks anymore, and my feet ached before I was halfway there. But I didn't slow. Each step forward felt like reclaiming something that had been quietly taken from me for years. When I reached Miller's General, the bell above the door chimed like a church bell in a quiet Sunday service. Ray Miller stood behind the counter, wiping down a jar of candy sticks like he had since the 80s. "Mrs. Blake," he said, eyes widening. "You all right?" "I just need a phone, Ray, and a little water if you have it." Within the hour, I was sitting in Mr. Alton's office, just as I'd planned. I laid the deed on his desk, watched as his eyes moved over the paper, recognition dawning. "This changes everything," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. "With this, we can stop any transaction they've put in motion." "I know," I said quietly. That afternoon, Mr. Alton filed an emergency motion with the district court. By sundown, a legal hold was in place, freezing every Vineyard-related document, every pending sale. Oliver and Clarissa wouldn't be able to sell a single grape without my say-so. And the best part? I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to beg. I had simply walked, one steady step after another, back into control of my life. By the following morning, the quiet streets of Hazelbrook were buzzing, not just with spring air and farmers' market stands, but with the kind of news that carried weight in a small town. The local paper's front-page headline read in bold black letters, "Family Dispute Halts Blake Vineyard's Sale." I was in Mr. Alton's office when the first calls came through. Developers, city officials, curious neighbors. Oliver and Clarissa's deal had officially collapsed. And I didn't need to lift a finger beyond placing that deed in Mr. Alton's hands. By noon, my prepaid phone rang. Clarissa. Her voice came in tight, clipped, nothing like the syrupy tone she used when selling homes. "Mom, we need to talk." I said nothing, simply listening. "We didn't know about the other land. You never told us. We thought—" "You thought you could take everything," I said calmly, voice steady like the quiet wind moving through orchard branches. There was a long pause before Clarissa spoke again, softer this time. "Can't we fix this?" But even then, there wasn't an apology. No ownership. Only desperation wrapped in guilt's disguise. "I'm not interested in fixing anything. Not with people who forget the value of their own roots." I hung up before she could say more. Later that afternoon, Oliver's name came up on the screen. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked down to Hazelbrook's community center, where a few local farmers had gathered to discuss crop rotations and water allocations. It was there,
sitting beneath the soft whir of ceiling fans and the scent of fresh soil, that I made my decision. I signed the final transfer papers. All water rights to the Blake Vineyard, especially those tied to my 40 acres, were officially donated to the Hazelbrook Agricultural Trust, a cooperative that protected local farms from commercial buyouts. With my signature, I ensured that Oliver and Clarissa couldn't sell the vineyard. Not now, not ever. The land was legally bound to serve the community. They could scream, threaten, or bargain all they wanted. But without water, a vineyard was just a field of dust and empty vines. By evening, word had spread. I sat on the balcony of my small apartment above the bakery, rocking gently in my chair as neighbors passed by, some offering me quiet nods of respect, others pausing long enough to share a few words. "Good on you, Naomi," Ray Miller said, tipping his cap as he walked by. They forgot whose name was really on that land. I only smiled, sipping my tea. Just as the sun dipped low, painting the orchard tops in golden orange, I received one final message, from Samantha this time. A single text. "Please, we didn't mean it for it to go like this." But meaning and action weren't the same. I set the phone aside. That night, as the town settled into quiet again, I found myself standing on the edge of the vineyard. The same soil Richard and I had tended for decades, now protected by law, by trust, and by legacy. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. By the end of that first month, standing quietly against the pull of Clarissa and Oliver's demands, I had found something unexpected: stillness. For the first time in years, my life wasn't ruled by urgent paperwork or harvest schedules. I wasn't anyone's afterthought. I wasn't a pawn in their schemes. I was simply Marion. Instead of returning to the family farmhouse that Clarissa and Oliver had tried so hard to sell out from under me, I signed a lease for a small stone cottage just past Willow Bend Road, overlooking the same valley I'd watched bloom each spring for decades. It was small, 2 bedrooms, wide front porch, sloped roof, but it was mine. No shared deed, no hidden contracts, my name and mine alone. In that quiet space, surrounded by potted lavender and herb boxes, I found peace. I filled my days teaching vineyard management classes at the Hazelbrook Community Center. Kids in their 20s, retirees looking for second careers, all eager to learn about pruning, grafting, sustainable watering practices. I taught them not because I wanted credit, but because knowledge that isn't passed on dies in silence. People stopped calling me Mrs. Blake out of habit. They started calling me by name again, Marion. One Saturday, while setting up a class, one of the younger women, a newlywed named Eliza, asked me, "Why didn't you just sell, Marion? You could have taken the money and lived easy." I thought about that. The easy answer was, because it wasn't just about money. But really, it was about something deeper. "Some things aren't for sale," I told her gently. "A name, a legacy, peace of mind." Eliza nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. I'd hear occasional rumors in town about Clarissa and Oliver. The developers had officially withdrawn from the Vineyard project. Hazelbrook's local paper published an article titled "Blake Vineyard Legacy Preserved." It wasn't front-page news in the wider world, but here in our little valley, it meant everything. Oliver had left Hazelbrook altogether, I heard, moving to the city to try and salvage his real estate career. Clarissa stayed for a few more months, but she rarely showed her face in public after what happened. She wasn't ostracized exactly. Hazelbrook isn't that kind of town, but people remembered. People saw. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Winning wasn't about making others lose. It was about standing quietly and letting the truth carry its own weight. One early evening in late summer, as the sun dipped low over the vineyard rows, I walked past the orchard with a small basket, gathering a few apples for baking. The air was warm, but carried that first whisper of fall. I paused at the old farmhouse gate, looking over the property. My property. Not because I'd screamed and fought, but because I had stood still, quietly firm, while others tried to take what wasn't theirs. I sat down on a wooden bench just inside the orchard gate, letting the sounds of the wind and distant laughter from town wash over me. That's when I realized I hadn't just protected the land, I had protected myself from being erased, from being forgotten. In the end, it wasn't about the vineyard or the money. It was about knowing I hadn't let them define the last chapters of my story. I closed my eyes, listening to the orchard creak in the wind, and for the first time in years, I felt fully, quietly, peacefully seen.
In the months that followed the injunction, Marion didn't just reclaim a vineyard, she reclaimed herself. She chose not to return to the old farmhouse. Instead, she made her new life above the bakery, on her own terms. From her small balcony overlooking Hazelbrook's main street, she could see the hills where the vineyard rows curved like lines in an old, familiar poem. The land still bloomed because she had stood up, quietly, when others thought she would crumble. Clarissa and Oliver's attempts to sell off the vineyard fell apart completely. The developer withdrew. The legal case surrounding the forged will was quietly closed once it became clear that Marion's original deed and Harold's injunction rendered the scheme impossible. In a town like Hazelbrook, stories like that don't fade, they echo. And Marion's name became quietly respected, not for drama, but for quiet dignity. She never sought revenge. It wasn't in her nature. What she wanted was peace, and she found it. In her quilting classes, in her garden, in teaching young people about the land that had given her so much. By placing the water rights in a trust for Hazelbrook's agricultural cooperative, Marion ensured that her legacy wasn't just about preserving her own story, it was about giving others a chance to write theirs. One evening, sitting on her balcony with a cup of tea, Marion watched the sunset turn the sky gold and lavender. Her phone buzzed quietly beside her. It was a message from Hazelbrook's cooperative board. Marion, the trust you created helped 3 new families plant their first orchards today. Thought you'd like to know. Marion smiled, setting the phone down. She didn't need public thanks or headlines. The orchard standing, the trust thriving, the land blooming again. That was enough. For those listening now, sometimes the loudest power is in quiet resolve. If you've ever been pushed aside or underestimated, remember, your strength isn't in shouting. It's in standing firm for what you built with your own 2 hands. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and help us tell more stories of quiet strength and reclaimed worth.